Hi everybody, Jane here, and today I'm going to be reviewing Some of My Friends Are by Deborah Plummer, PhD. Now before we begin, I did want to mention that I got this book from a Library Things giveaway. So it was sent to me by the publisher with their hopes that I would review it. However, I am giving this review voluntarily and everything I say is my own thoughts on it. If you are somebody who likes to get free books, I highly recommend Library Things giveaways. I'm not sponsored or anything by them. I just have had a lot of success with winning free books. And I know people who are on a book budget, sometimes it's really, really hard to get books. And it's such a great program. I am so grateful that Library Things and also Goodreads has a giveaway program. But this came from Library Things, and it was amazing that the publisher sent that to me, so thank you so much. So let's start talking about this book. It is a non-fiction book that looks at cross-racial friendships. I will say it focuses mostly, in my opinion, on people who are in the US and people who are like Caucasians having friendships with people who are African American or people who are Hispanic living in the US. The author is African American, and it's very much, she brings a lot of her perspective into it, which I appreciated. She has a lot to say about cross-racial friendships. I don't know that all of it applies if you are looking more at friends outside of the US. I think I'm bringing this up because I have several friends who are in other countries, and the fact that ahead of time we recognize that our experiences are probably pretty different has really helped us cope with the differences in our races. Like, the issue has been less about you're black and I'm white and more about you come from Bangladesh or you come from Pakistan. Things are obviously different there, and so we have to kind of check ourselves and think about that when we're talking to each other. And I think that's one of the things that Deborah Plummer talks about that's really important in her book, is that Caucasian people, whites, tend to have this idea that everybody is the same. And I have totally said that kind of thing before. I've totally felt or had the thought of, well, people are people and aren't we all just the same? And one of the things she mentions is that's a really unhealthy and unhelpful view, because white people have privilege that they don't recognize, and blacks don't view things, at least according to her, in that way. They're not saying, oh, well, I'm just like you. Instead, they're saying, you can't understand my experiences because you haven't lived it. And I'm sitting here, me and other people who, have always been like, oh, everybody's the same. You're sitting here saying we're the same, and I'm sitting here saying, no, you can't understand where I'm coming from. Not really. So that was very enlightening. There was a lot of this book that was really interesting, and I definitely absolutely think it's an important book. I don't think I've mentioned this yet. My rating was a 4 out of 5. I loved all the information in this book. It is so thought-provoking and important, and wow, it just blew me away with how I'd never thought about things the way they were presented before, but it opened my eyes to a lot of my own interactions that maybe have not been appropriate because I just didn't know differently. So it was a really great book. I think it's especially great for people who find it a bit of a struggle. I live in an area that doesn't have a lot of diversity. So until I was an adult, I'd never had any kinds of cross-racial friendship. Now, when I moved to a bigger city, I did meet a lot more diverse people, and I became friends with several of them. Now, she does talk too about the degree of friendships and how most people, if they do have cross-racial friendships, it's more of a coworker friendship. And in truth, that's what I have. But in fairness, I have 2 best friends that are the only people I hang out with. So I feel like it's not that big of it's not surprising that I don't have a more diverse group of best friends because I have 2 of them. So, but that is one thing she mentions, is that a lot of our friendships with people of other races tend to not be as close. We tend to have our closest relationships with people of the same race because we have such similar experiences and background, and she calls it tribalism. She says we are attracted to spend time with and be around people who look like us and seem like us. So yeah, this was really enlightening for somebody who comes from a very non-diverse area. And it was really cool because Plummer actually grew up in Ohio, or at least did some of her growing up in Ohio. But she grew up in like the big cities, and I grew up in the little cities. So it's obviously so different of an experience, because up until I grew up and moved to Columbus, I'd never really been around anybody who was different than me. Everybody basically in my high school was white. I think there was one person who wasn't white. And then there was a Vietnamese family that I went to school with one person who was Vietnamese, and I don't think there was any other real diversity. It was a really not diverse area. So this was an eye-opening book. One of the issues I did have with it, and this is just, be aware if you read it. Deborah Plummer is a PhD, and she is so smart, and she writes so smart. And I consider myself a fairly intelligent, educated person, and I definitely struggled in places. So this is absolutely a book for the well-educated, and even then it might be a struggle. So I did think that was kind of a downside, is it wasn't as accessible as I would have liked it to be. I would have liked a book that was more accessible to people who are maybe not willing to or able to dive through something so complex and so dense. There were times I had to look up some of the words she used because I wasn't familiar with them. And just in general, it took me a really long time to read this book, and I really struggled in parts of it just because of how information dense it was. And that's one thing I generally have an issue with in nonfiction anyway. I get it, it's hard to make it super entertaining. And I did love the personal stories that she brought in. That was probably the best part of this book, was, the personal stories between her and her friends that she shares. But if you want to read this book, just be aware going into it that it's a little bit, I don't want to say dense, because it's not like it's filled with all the scientific language, but it's definitely, it'll keep you on your toes, and it's a lot of work to read. And so if you are not in the mood to read something that is that complex, maybe wait for a better time. Some of the stuff that she talked about that I wanted to touch on, because I thought it was really cool, was things like institutional racism that we, as in me, a Caucasian person, wouldn't ever considered racist, but it is. She talks about an experience she had as a nun, and how all of the foods that they ate were not things that were typical to her culture and background. And she was like the only white nun, or I'm sorry, she was the only black nun. And so it was very difficult for her, because it wasn't obviously overt racism. Nobody was being mean to her about the fact that she was black, but they also, the foods that they were eating and stuff was not stuff that she'd grown up eating. And I never thought about that as being an issue. I went to a very diverse church at one time, and I noticed it felt so different. And I couldn't really put my finger on it, but I think that it was really well integrated, and maybe that was part of why I was like, well, this just feels different. The music was a little bit different. The the foods at potlucks and stuff, it was a little bit different. So I think that's a good thing, but it's something that I wouldn't recognize as racist. Like, I wouldn't even think about, well, the music that we have is more traditional English, Anglo-Saxon, and not at all, not culturally relevant. So that was really interesting. Another thing she talks about is humor, and how there are things that we might think are funny that aren't really funny, or that aren't funny coming from people who are of different races. Kind of a Chris Rock can make fun of black people because he's Chris Rock and he's black, but if somebody white does it, it's really not funny, it's racist. So she kind of talks about some of that in the book, and being aware of humor and being careful about humor when you're friends with somebody of a different race, because they may not think things are funny that you do. And also some of the complexities of things, like because of who I am and my privilege, there may be something I say that is completely insensitive and I wouldn't even realize it if I was talking to somebody who was of a different race than I was in a different background. So there's so many important things she talks about. She does talk about something that I never had words for and I could never put my finger on, but I understood. And that was that when I was at work making friends with people of different races, they tend to have a lot in common with me. They tended to, have a degree in college. They tended to be professionals, obviously, in some cases working together. We were all professionals. But, if they were people I worked with when I worked at McDonald's or I worked at a hotel, I tended to be drawn to make friendships with the people who were in college like I was. And it was interesting that she talked about how that's kind of a thing. We do tend to make friends with people who are more like us. And I never considered before that there are times that especially, well-educated Blacks and Hispanics who are trying to fit in to basically a white culture have to really change how they act and how they speak and kind of pretend to be something they aren't so that they're more acceptable and so that they can have those relationships a little easier, which is one of the reasons that it can take a lot of work for them too to have white friends, because it can be difficult for whites to understand their cultural needs. So this book was so informative and so interesting, and wow, so much information and thought-provoking stuff. I really do think that everybody should read it, at the very least to get a better understanding of cross-racial friendships. One thing that I thought was so nice about the book is she does talk about statistically how the younger generations, because of the internet, are having so many more transracial friendships. They're finding so many things, or cross-racial friendships. They're finding so many things that they have in common with people, especially because the world is so big now. And I have somewhat experienced that. I have a friend in Pakistan who I'm fairly close to the point of text messaging multiple times a week. I had a friend in Bangladesh who I was really close to for a while. The friendships kind of fizzled because of some personal things, but for a while they were my really good friend, and it was really cool having that friendship with somebody who was different, but we had so much in common that it didn't matter that they were from Bangladesh, or it didn't matter that they were from Pakistan. It didn't matter that they were a different race and a different religion. We still had stuff to talk about. And I think the younger generation especially is seeing that we do have so much commonality, not just globally, but, locally too. So people are making friends playing video games. That's something we see on Twitch. My boyfriend and I watch a lot of Twitch, which is a video game streaming site if you're not familiar with that. And, there's such diversity on there. And I think that has really helped create a lot of acceptance of not just racial diversity, but also to our LGBTQ as well, because people are becoming friends with people who they might have thought, oh, I can't be friends with somebody who's different than me, but then they're finding they have all this in common, and it's changing the face of friendships. So she did touch on the hope for the future, and also on the importance of cross-racial friendships, because the more we look at cross-racial friendships, the more we're going to start getting along better in general. There's going to be less them and us, and it's going to be a more united world. And I kind of see this too globally. I can imagine it's going to be a lot harder to have wars in the future, because those wars are going to affect people that you know and you care about. It's going to be less like, oh, everybody in that country is terrible, like we've kind of had in the past views of that. And instead, well, Bob's over there. I don't know. I'm not good at coming up with names. Bob's over there. Well, I know Bob's not a bad person, so obviously not everybody over there is bad. Are we really sure that we want to fight these people? This group, even, when it comes to religion, I have a lot of friends who are Muslim, and that was something that I wasn't really able to do previously because I grew up, I was in high school when 9/11 happened. And the idea of being friends with a Muslim, that wasn't something that was in my world. And now that I've had friends who are Muslim, I definitely have a whole different perspective on that. And when people say nasty things about Muslims, that really upsets me because I have friends who are, they're different than me, but I know that they are a lot more similar than I give them credit for, or I would have given them credit for previously. I hope I haven't offended anybody with the things I've had to say. Race is such a difficult thing to talk about because, we want to be politically correct and inoffensive, but another thing that Plummer talks about is the fact that we want to be politically correct and inoffensive kind of makes it hard too, because sometimes during or in cross-racial friendships, people who are Black want to talk about race. And whites tend to be afraid of that. And I can understand that. That's an uncomfortable topic. But I can't be educated, and I can't be a better person, and I can't be a better friend to people of other races if I don't pay attention to those things, and if I shut down the conversation when it comes to race. So this was a really eye-opening book. I loved the personal example she gave. I love all the information it gave me. The big reason it's not a 5 out of 5 is just it was really difficult education level wise. I've only got an associate's degree and she's got a PhD for me to understand. I definitely would have liked it to be a little more easy of a read, because I think it took me probably 10 hours, 9 or 10 hours, and this is not a very big book, to read through it. But it was a really slow, difficult read, and I had to look up a lot of things, and it may not be to you. Be aware of that too. This was something that I was reading and I had a lot of distractions, a lot of things going on. I have 2 kids at home, so reading a book is hard in the best of days, but this definitely was a bit of work to read. So that was the only thing that I can really say negatively about it. I love the information. I thought the author was very knowledgeable, came at things from a really interesting perspective. And overall, this was a really good book, and I recommend it. Just, again, be aware that it's just not a nice way of saying it. You better be pretty educated to read it, because if you're not, it is not a very accessible book for people who don't have high levels of education. And who aren't good readers. So this is not a good beginner book. This is not, if you're not a typical reader, if you don't typically read nonfiction, this is probably not the book for you. This is definitely a book I feel like you need to be fairly literate and educated to read, because, oh man, it's a lot. All right, guys, this is Jane. I post Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. My social media is down below. Please like and subscribe, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.